Welcome to 247 Real Talk. This is your host, Julian Perry. It's a pleasure to be here with you once again. I am recording this episode. It is Wednesday, March 8th at approximately 8:15 p.m. As I mentioned to you before, when I choose the topic for each week's podcast, it comes from something that motivates me and drives me to give you some commentary and perspective on it. This week is a very important and very incredible, I don't know what adjective to wrap around it, but it's a very, very critical topic. And it's entitled, Justice Denied, the Tragic Reality of Wrongful Executions of Black Men. So sit back, relax, and I'll be right back. So welcome back again. As I said, I'm your host, Julian Perry, and this is 247 Real Talk Podcast episode. Now, my episode, the content today is very specific, and it's very specific because it has to do with something that's going on in Texas right now. We've often heard about stories over the last few years of many men of color, black men, let's be real here, who have been exonerated after spending 20 and 30 years in prison or more. Because at the time, we didn't have the right forensic evidence. At the time, the prejudice and racism was so blatant and so lopsided that, it was easy to blame minorities, especially black men, for crimes. With very little evidence, they were sentenced to life in prison. They were sentenced to death. They were executed. And in many cases recently, the Innocence Group and other organizations have really felt the need to come to their defense. And those groups are made up of people of all races, creeds, and colors. And they have managed to get a few people convictions overturned. And we keep seeing a trend of how wrongful this is. I am particularly moved to present this episode because it has to do with something very specific. I'm not sure at the time of day, but in Texas tomorrow, a man by the name of Arthur Brown is scheduled to be executed. I checked my social media right before, my news, I should say, breaking news right before I got on this episode, and I just saw that the judge denied the stay of execution a few hours ago. So to many of you, Arthur Brown will just sound like another name. And this has given me an opportunity because I did the research. I found a write-up on him. And I actually found that Richard Branson of all, who's someone I'm about to say of all people, but someone who is affluent and someone who is progressive, is the one who brought it to my attention, at least on my LinkedIn profile. And so a lot of what I'm going to present to you in this episode before I give my own perspective is going to be something I'm reading. And it's not lengthy, but I hope that you pay attention, and I want you to hear the story. Because Arthur Brown's story is just another episode in the episodes of this life we're living and the injustices done to people of color, to minorities, and specifically black men who over time have been just blamed for many crimes and spent a lot of time in jail. When I'm not talking about people who are guilty, I'm talking about people whose innocence was obvious. People who, as time has gone on, technology has advanced. We found that either someone else was responsible for the crime, or that they were convicted based on what has to be seen as not evidence, but the color of their skins. So let me get right into this, and I will be reading. Arthur Brown has lived on Texas death row for 30 years. Arthur has long maintained his innocence, and his conviction was based on thin evidence, including forensic evidence that a court has called plainly flawed. A court has said the evidence, the forensic evidence that was presented that has had this man on death row for 30 years was plainly flawed. An eyewitness testimony obtained through faulty police techniques. More recently, Arthur's new attorneys from the Office of Capital and Forensic Writs and the Dallas Capital Habeas Unit have uncovered evidence previously suppressed by the district attorney's office that shows that other men, not Arthur, committed the murder. Let me read that to you again. Most recently, Arthur's new attorneys from the Office of Capital and Forensic Writs and the Dallas Capital Habeas Unit have uncovered evidence previously suppressed by the district attorney's office that shows that other men, not Arthur, committed the murder. And Arthur's jury never heard the story of his childhood, rife with abject poverty, physical and emotional abuse, and violence. Nor did they hear about Arthur's intellectual impairments and the symptoms of fetal alcohol disorder. Now, I think while that last paragraph is important, because I think what they're saying is even though, besides all the evidence of him being innocent, the fact that is, if they heard about his childhood when the sentence was set out, executed, it might not have even been execution, right? It might have been years or life imprisonment or whatever to begin with. I go on. The state of Texas seeks to execute Arthur on March 9th, 2023, despite evidence of his innocence and signs that he has serious intellectual impairments. Arthur's attorneys have asked Texas Governor Greg Abbott and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles to commute his sentence to life in prison, or in the alternative to grant a reprieve. Now notice why that paragraph I referred to before was important, because they said they at least asked him to change it to life imprisonment, giving them more time to show and continue to bring this evidence forward that will ultimately, based on what I'm reading here, and if it falls true, remember, innocent until proven guilty, it would likely exonerate him. They are also advocating for relief before Texas courts. So let's talk about Arthur's childhood. Arthur was born to an alcoholic mother and abusive father. Born in 1970, Arthur grew up in abject poverty. He was his father's, listen to this, he was his father's 36th child. I did not stutter. He was his father's 36th child. Arthur's mother binge drank throughout her pregnancy with Arthur. Her drinking was so severe that at month 4 or 5 of her pregnancy with Arthur, she started hemorrhaging and had to go on bed rest. Now, before I continue, let me say that I printed this out from something that on LinkedIn that I believe, I want to be correct, came from someone, the media team, from Richard Branch. I'm not 100% sure if I'm recalling it correct, and I don't want to offend anyone or call anyone's name incorrectly. But I did not write this. This is something that I'm printing off of as part of the movement to save Arthur Brown. And I think the message I got on LinkedIn asked me to join in insisting the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and Governor Abbott save Arthur Brown. And I did sign up to save, as a part of the petition, to save Arthur Brown. Arthur's mother's severe alcoholism continued throughout his childhood. On school nights, she would come home at 3 a.m. after partying at clubs and wake up her children and force them to recite the Lord's Prayer. They had so much trouble sleeping that Arthur's father took them to sleep on a mattress in their van. Arthur's mother drank every day. Arthur's father severely abused the family. He beat Arthur's mother and subjected her to emotional abuse. Arthur grew up seeing his mother's face bruised and battered from his father's fists. Arthur's father beat Arthur until blood poured from his mouth and whipped him with a leather belt. Arthur's parents abandoned him and his siblings alone without food, leaving them to scavenge for something to eat. When Arthur was 9 years old, his father abandoned the family, causing them to descend further into extreme poverty. Arthur's mother took him and his siblings to live in the projects, into an apartment that was filled with roaches and rats. The projects were a violent place to grow up. When he was a child, Arthur saw a drug dealer pull a gun on his uncle just a few feet from his doorstep. Now we're going to talk about Arthur's intellectual impairments. Arthur suffered from intellectual impairments arising from potential intellectual disability and fetal alcohol disorder. Arthur showed signs of possible intellectual disability from a young age. He was placed in special education and scored in the range of intellectual disability with an IQ test when he was 8 years old. Arthur showed signs of fetal alcohol disorder, a form of brain damage that can happen when a mother drinks extremely heavily during her pregnancy. Although he faced extreme adversity, Arthur developed deep bonds of love with his family, his life partner, and his children. As he grew, Arthur became close to his many siblings and often babysat his nieces and nephews. He formed a committed partnership with Onetha, the woman he loved, and they had children and lived together. When he was only 21 years old, Arthur was arrested for a crime he did not commit. His conviction was based on forensic evidence that the court has since described as plainly false and questionable eyewitness testimony. At age 21, Arthur was arrested for the killings of 4 people in a southwest Houston home in 1993. His conviction was based on faulty forensic evidence. Ballistics testimony that the trial court has since observed was plainly false, and inconsistent eyewitness testimony that either failed to identify Arthur at all or only identified him after suggestive police tactics. One eyewitness initially described the assailants who looked nothing like Arthur, only identifying Arthur after highly suggestive photo spreads. A second eyewitness never identified Arthur in a photo spread, only identifying him at trial because he was sitting in the defendant's seat. But since then, that same eyewitness has been unable to identify Arthur at all. A third eyewitness studied a photo spread for 30 minutes before identifying someone other than Arthur. That eyewitness only finally identified Arthur when guided to do so by an officer. 2 more eyewitnesses were never able to identify Arthur. In 2022, Arthur received new lawyers who, in 2023, uncovered evidence that other men, not Arthur, committed the murder. This evidence had been suppressed by the district attorney's office and had never been handed over to defense counsel. Arthur has shown himself to be a peaceful and upstanding person on Texas death row. While on death row for the past 30 years, Arthur has had 0 incidents of violence. Anthony Graves, a death row exoneree, described how Arthur has dispelled tensions between people who were incarcerated and showering them with wisdom and knowledge. In Arthur, he saw someone who always was trying to improve himself, someone striving to make the world a better place, advocate for people, and advocate for justice. Now, what I read to you again is not my own words. I did read it off of posting on LinkedIn, and I want to keep repeating that because the fact is it is so powerful that I'm making that clear that it's not my story. I wish I had the ability to interview Arthur. I wish I had the ability to bring Arthur's story to the world. And why is this critical? Maybe because we have all witnessed so many stories of men who have been in prison for so long and have been exonerated. Black men. And this is predominantly black men. I remember looking at the America's Got Talent show, and this gentleman came out to sing one time, and he was an older gentleman, so they were kind of surprised. And it turned out that that was one of his dreams that he was fulfilling, because he had been in prison for, I think, 32 years or something like that, and then exonerated. There's nothing we can do, no amount of money, no amount of showering of anything we can do to repay someone when they lose 30 years of their life. Not even 1 year, not even 1 minute. But the fact is, this is much more serious. With everything that I've read to you, with everything that talks about witnesses who couldn't identify him, with everything that where there's enough evidence to bring in front of a judge to say, hey, pause. I don't think that the lawyers are even saying to the judge now, oh, you can never execute him. They're saying, pause for a moment. We've only had a year in 2022. We're in 2023, right? We had COVID. We're now still, I would say, in some level of COVID, right? So in 2022, post the height of COVID, Arthur gets new lawyers. Here we are in March, early in 2023. And you would tell me that there isn't a single human being, from the governor, from the judges, who will pause a moment to say, okay, let me stay this execution, let me see this evidence, let me hear everything, if not for anything more than the fact that life has now shown us over the last decade how many black men have been exonerated. If I thought about it before I came on this episode, I would have done some research to get an exact number of how many black men have been exonerated over the last decade. How many times you see this story in the news where they come out of jail and what do they all say? I'm not bitter, I'm just glad to be out. And this is not where they were exonerated because they found out that there wasn't enough evidence. Many of those cases they were exonerated because they found out after DNA testing that someone else, either known to them, someone else already in prison, or someone else who was in prison and deceased, but someone else with a record committed the crimes. Each time that I've read about these stories, it's not just that the evidence doesn't match, it's the fact that in most cases they have found the actual killer. Here we have a situation where the lawyers are saying, and these are lawyers who do work to help people who are in prison and who are on death row, who they believe are innocent. So the way I understand it, a lot of these lawyers don't take these cases unless they believe after reviewing the case that the person is innocent. They've been able to show, as I read to you, and again, I can't attest to any fact here. I'm attesting to the fact that this situation is going on right now. And I'm saying to you that they're saying that not only can they prove that other men did it, they can prove that most of the eyewitnesses either couldn't identify Arthur at all or didn't identify him until after going 30 minutes through a photo lineup. And then you know how these things can go, where someone says, you sure this is not his picture? Doesn't this look like him? So you get sort of directed to the person. And this happens every day. We have a situation here in New York where, if you remember the case of the Central Park Five, the 5 young black men who were convicted of rape and later exonerated, and it was, we found out that each one of them had their confessions. They were coerced, and people wonder. People always say when they're not on that side of the table, well, I would never admit to something I didn't do. But I think the whole environment is designed to put you in a place where you feel like you can't win. And then you're presented with, look, you could do life imprisonment or you could do a couple of years and come out and continue your life. What you going to do? But we got you cold. And, there's nothing to say that you didn't do it. And, if you go to court, you're going to lose. And there's a lot of things you can tell, especially young minds. And eventually they will bend. Even older people, even grown folks my age who might think, I've got kids, I've got this, I've got that. At this point, it's a losing battle. I've got nothing to defend myself. I simply didn't do it, but I was there, and I have no proof because I was by myself, and they're saying I look like the person, and someone identified me, and if I go into court and I take my chances, I might get life. So you know what? Let me do the 2 years or the 3 years if I come and go back to my family. Only to find out that after you go through the brutality of being in prison, that the real people are caught, or someone cares enough because you keep pleading innocence to take your case up, and then they realize this is what happened. So I chose to do this topic tonight, and I chose to come to you with this as information. And here's why I'm saying information. It's not, I don't know if I can ever say it will be to help Arthur. And this is because my episodes air on Fridays at 1 a.m. It is Wednesday, March 8th. This Friday is March 10th when you will hear this episode for the first time. Arthur is scheduled to be executed tomorrow, March 9th. So the really sad, tearful truth here is by the time most of you hear or look at this episode, unless there's a miracle, and I will pray for one, I don't know Arthur's life. Some of our lives are filled with tragic stories. Some people's families are filled with tragic stories. Some things happen to people and we don't know why. But unless there's a miracle, when you listen to this episode on Friday, March 10th, Arthur will be dead. Arthur would have been executed by lethal injection. And the sad part is that if the lawyers continue to push even after his execution, and they're able to finally bring out all of this truth to the surface, and we find out that Arthur was in fact 100% innocent, no amount of money that you give to his remaining relatives can do anything to change Arthur's life. His life partner, the woman that he shares his life with, his children who have to bear the trauma of watching their father executed. And understand this, if you have a parent who is in jail and on death row, and that parent is guilty, having that parent executed for a crime, even if they're guilty, will be very painful. I can imagine, because they're still your blood, your parent, the person who is one half that brought you into this world. But having to live with the fact that you lose a parent who was wrongfully executed by a system that's supposed to be designed to protect us and only deal with the truth and nothing but the truth, has to be painful. I am not sitting in Texas. I am not the judge. I am not the governor. I don't know even if they're seeing evidence that my story or the story that I copied from LinkedIn does not include. But if for one moment, and if you Google, and I said, when you hear this on Friday morning, unless something miraculous happens, the story will be the past tense, because Arthur will no longer be with us. But if you Google the name Arthur Brown, and it's called something Southampton, something murders, but you do Arthur Brown, Texas, the whole story will come up. So even after this episode and after whatever happens tomorrow, I encourage you to go Google Arthur Brown. Go, and again, it's Texas. Go look at the story. Do as much research as you can for your own satisfaction, that either the story that I'm reading from is terribly flawed, or this system that we've watched imprison black men by huge numbers, and also recently in the last decade, exonerate them in pretty large numbers too, because the evidence was either prejudice, false, coerced, or we were just scapegoats because of the color of our skins. If for one moment you have something in you that demands that life must be preserved and people who are innocent should not be executed, that people who are innocent should not be in jail, that people who can't afford $1 million lawyer should get a fair defense, your wealth, your social, economic status should not determine whether you can be free to be with your family and watch your children grow and attend maybe the funerals even of parents who pass, but rather sit in a jail in a place that punishes you, because we know there's no rehabilitation in jail. It's a survival game that many don't survive, or many are painfully brutalized for all the time they're in there. If you feel for one moment to the human being next to you, if you understand that as a person of color, and even not a person of color, even someone who is not a minority, who doesn't have certain financial needs, could find themselves in a difficult situation too. If you feel for Arthur Brown for a moment, if you're interested in all the Arthur Browns who are in jail, who need someone to listen, especially when they're not only proclaiming innocence but when we see flaws, blatant flaws in their defense, in the evidence, and in the eyewitnesses and we see a possibility that someone else committed the crime, we need to first pause. We need to become part of a movement loud enough that the world hears us. We need to get some, I don't know what to suggest that we get changed. But I don't see tonight, as I record this episode, what the harm would be, since these lawyers have been arguing this case, that the judge would say, pause. Pause for 30 days. Let's dedicate 30 days to bringing all this evidence out, back in front of, a jury, in front of whomever. Let's be 100% sure that every single thing that's presented in Arthur Brown's defense has been thoroughly examined and deemed to be true or not true. Let's be 100% sure that Arthur Brown actually murdered these 4 people. And if for 1 second he didn't, while we continue to fight and to find the truth, there is no pain if in fact there's any doubt that he's guilty of commuting his sentence to life, or even pausing the execution long enough to find the truth. I don't know about you and all my audience that I speak to. And I'm speaking to every single one regardless of race, creed, or color. We all have family. We all feel pain when we lose a loved one. And I can imagine how much the pain is magnified when we lose a loved one to a situation where they're innocent, snatched before and our eyes snatched out of our lives, and then eventually executed as we scream not guilty. Whether we were able to save Arthur or not, like I said, this podcast won't do it because it's too late. I learned about this too late. The most I was able to do was sign the petition to stay the execution, and obviously, as I read a few moments ago online, it hasn't worked. But if we do in fact lose Arthur Brown, I want you, each and every one of you, to look around you at your friends, at your coworkers, to go home and look at your families, your children, your parents, your cousins, your brothers, your sisters, people close to you, your neighbors and friends, whomever you find dear to your heart. Look at anyone that you care about and imagine them being snatched from your lives and being brutalized and going through a system when you know in every part of your being that they're innocent, and watch a system put them to death. If you feel enough pain by closing your eyes and imagine that scenario, then this is another part of a movement you must join to make our lives, all our lives, better. I don't know about you, but each time I come on the podcast and I find a reason to bring another cause to light, it changes me. And I'm hoping that, and it changes me in a positive way, it changes me in a call to action way. I'm doing a lot, but I always feel it's not enough I'm doing. There's something else I can do to bring awareness and to hope to get other people to join the movement. We control our destiny. We've given over all our power to the government that we hired, to the lawmakers that we hired, that we vote for. So we hire them. We employ them. And we fail to recognize that if we're united in what's righteous, we can change the direction that things have gone in and how badly they've run off course. It's time for these things to stop. I have friends of every race, creed, or color, and I'm sorry, I don't see the color. I don't see it because I see human beings around me, in front of me, and any one of them I go to and have a need, they will help, and vice versa. I will leave you with this. When you hear this episode, I will say it again. I want you to pause and think of Arthur Brown. I want you to do your research and just Google it for a second, Arthur Brown, Texas. And if when you hear this episode, Arthur is still alive, then I would ask you to find out where you can sign petitions, whatever, to join the voices loud enough to at least have the thorough investigation done and the evidence that's come to light be thoroughly examined and applied. If after that we found that the evidence does not change things, that he was in fact guilty, then so be it. But again, the history of the last few decades have shown that in so many cases, we've imprisoned minority, black men. We've imprisoned them for a third of their lives or more, and they never did a thing wrong. I want you to understand how that would feel like if that's yours. I also want you to if you wake up when you hear this on Friday morning, if you Google him and you found out that Arthur was executed, take a moment to say a prayer for him and his family. Irrespective of his horrible childhood and upbringing, he is a human being. And he's a human being who would have been removed from our lives without us being very sure that he deserved the punishment he received. I'm your host, Julian Perry. This has been 247 Real Talk Podcast. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Until the next time or until we speak again, take care of yourselves and each other.